Hi everyone. So today what we're going to be looking at is data dictionaries. Now you'll be pleased to hear that actually at Higher there's no difference to data dictionaries than what you found at National 5. So what I've done here is found the National 5 appendix based on data dictionaries and provided it for you, and I'll attach it to this week's task so you can use it to help. Now the main point of a data dictionary is once you have analysed a problem, you've broke down what your end user and functional requirements are, you're then moving on to creating your perhaps entity occurrence diagrams or entity relationship diagrams, and you are then wanting to design the entity specifically within that to store the individual attributes in an appropriate format, because if you don't have a format set and stored properly, then that's when data is stored incorrectly, and then when people come to search for information, it can be really difficult or impossible to find. So we need to make sure the information in the database is accurate, and we do this by creating a proper data dictionary. Now, to create a data dictionary, you will always be given some sample data, and it's really important to look at this sample data carefully to ensure that you have all the appropriate validation and restrictions built into your database to ensure the data is stored correctly. Okay, now you can see in this example here, we've been given two of the entities from the travel agency database, the resort and the hotel entities, and what we're being asked to do is we've been asked to put that into a data dictionary format. Okay, now a couple of things that I want to point out that should be obvious from having a look at this data. If we start off with the resort table, we can see the resort ID is just a number. Now that could be set up as an auto number, it could just be set up as a number. They both happen to have three characters, but I don't know that I necessarily would put a length check on that per se, just because obviously the more resorts are perhaps added to the database, the bigger that could get. But if it is like say maybe a database for a specific country, like Scotland, and there can only be a specific number of different types of resorts or resort IDs, then you could put a cap on that to make sure that nobody types in the wrong number. Okay, we've then got town. Again, the words that have been used there are quite short. You might want to put a length check on them. It's quite good to have a size set up for your databases. All the ones that are text specifically having a size set up, and the reason for that is it keeps your overall storage for your database smaller. Microsoft Access in particular, if you don't set sizes to your fields or your attributes within the database, will default the sizes to 255 characters because they need it to be of a fixed size in order for you to be able to dynamically access the data one at a time. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to try and get away from having that huge field size, that huge attribute size of 255, and we want to take it down a little bit so that it's not too big. So you might want to set that to something like 30 or 40 so that it's a more reasonable size, but still going to have plenty of space to be able to store longer town names than the ones that we've got listed there. Resort type is listed to coastal and island. Now this is where you might want to maybe speak to your customers and see if there's maybe a restriction on this. So in Scotland we're only going to have a set number of resort types. Now with the SQA information or anything that you're given from us, if it's not been kind of specifically explained or you can't see something that's obvious, then I wouldn't worry too much about these marks. But for example, you might have coastal resorts, island resorts, spa resorts, golf resorts, and you would probably want to pull that information from the users and just make sure you had sort of like a fixed number of entries that could be in there rather than leaving that completely open. So you're kind of grouping resorts together. And then under train station, you've got true or false, which is great because you can very quickly see that's going to be stored as a Boolean type, and that makes it a lot easier for us to put in and also save the user a lot of typing because they can just choose between the two options. If we have a little look at the hotel entity, we can see we've got lots of information being stored in there. Now, there's lots of different types of validation that we can do. Again, you've learned about these at National 5, but things like presence checks, length checks, range checks, and restricted choice are the main four that we look at within database. Now, phone numbers are a really good example of where you probably have to set it up as text because it starts with a 0. We've talked about that in programming before. But what you might want to do is you might want to put a length check on that as 11 characters and make sure that they've specifically typed in all the numbers. They've not used spaces. It makes it easier to save it in the database, especially if you're going to use it to call from. Okay, so that's a really good example of where you might want to put in a length check. You can see we've got the resort ID there as a foreign key, so we link those two tables together, our entity relationship diagrams, and they're also being linked here in our in our sample data. So if we have that in our data dictionary, we need to make sure that under the validation, we talk about how those two tables are linked together and where to find that foreign key from. And I'll show you the format of that in a second. Then star rating. Now, I think we can probably safely presume that star rating goes from 1 to 5. And if that's the case, then we're going to have a wee range check on there to make sure that only the numbers 1 to 5 can be entered. Now, here's an interesting one, season start date. Okay, now you can see that 2 of the hotels have a season start date and 1 of the hotels doesn't. That probably means that it opens all year round and doesn't have a season start date that it begins with at the start of the year. Now, if one of them doesn't have the information, that doesn't mean that there's an error in the information you've been given. What it means is that that information isn't required by the database. So under a presence check, that field or that attribute would need to be set to not required. And to be honest, most of the time, all of the fields are required. And if it hasn't specifically got an example like this, where you can't see one empty, I would presume that everything is required until told otherwise. Okay. Under swimming pool, again, quite easily seen that it's Boolean. Now, meal plan's a really good example of why sample data is so important, because if you think about going on holiday, when you get offered a meal plan, it's usually room only, half board, bed and breakfast, full board, all inclusive, that type of thing. But you would not be able to guess that that information was stored using 2 letters unless you've seen the sample data. So it is important to make sure that you have checked your sample data to see how that's been used, because that could be set to a restricted choice. It could also be set to a length check of 2 characters potentially, if you wanted to do it in a slightly different way. Okay, and then we've got our check-in time, and you can see that all of the different bits of information are stored in different ways. So we're not restricted to the same data types that we would use in programming. So we can store things like times and dates and text and numbers, etc. Okay, so let's have a little look and see how this looks in an actual data dictionary. Now, for a data dictionary, the layout is always the same. So each entity has its own table. These two happen to be joined together, but they can be separate. Each entity starts off with the name of the entity itself, and that's really important. And then underneath, you have the specific number of columns. You're always going to have 6 columns for each of your entities to state the information about each specific attribute. Okay, starts off with the attribute name. These should come right from your entity relationship diagram. It doesn't matter what order they're in. It's probably good practice to put the primary key first. And quite often you find the foreign key at the bottom, but it doesn't really matter where that is. It just depends on how you've laid out. Okay, the next column you've got is key. Now, the only things you'll ever have listed in this column is your PK for primary key or FK for foreign key. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in the appendix from last week's work was a compound key. And a compound key basically just means if you don't have one specific attribute in your database that you will uniquely identify each record within your database, then sometimes a combination of 2 or more primary keys are required, or 2 or more fields, I should say, 2 or more attributes are required to make one primary key. Okay, quite often we replace this with something called a surrogate key that you don't need to learn about till advanced higher, but things like an ID number, a reference number are really perfect primary keys and what we use most of the time. But we will come on to do some exercises with compound keys just so you can see what that looks like. Okay, the third one along is type. And under type, you can see the different types that we can have in our database section. So rather than using the words integer or real, we're using number. For string, we use just text. We've got Boolean, which is our normal one that we're used to using. And then we've also got date and time. Okay. The next column along, you'll notice size is only applicable to any of the ones which are text. Now, size is the size of the field. As I mentioned earlier on, it's not a length check, so it doesn't mean it will check that that's 20 characters long. What it means is that's the maximum size that it can be, but it will make your database a lot smaller if you set this up as a specific size. Okay, we've then got a column specifically used for presence checks, because presence checks are so important in databases. So we've got a presence check that happens first of all before we look at any of our other different types of validation, and all that's listed under that column is yes or no. And as you could see, as I mentioned earlier on, most of the fields are set to yes, presence is required, so all of them say yes, apart from the season start date, which was set to no because that was the one that previously we had missing from our sample data, so we know that it's not necessarily required. Okay, the last field here is validation. Now that's where you're going to fill in any other validation. So things like foreign keys, restricted choice, range checks, and length checks. Okay, so everything apart from your presence check goes in that last column, which is why it's a little bit larger, a little bit wider, because you're going to have more information. Okay, now I didn't actually know this, but see when I mentioned earlier on about there perhaps being restricted choice on the different types of resorts, that absolutely has happened here. So we've got coastal, city, island. They maybe didn't mention spa or golf, but that would be a conversation that would have with the user. Okay, you can always take a guess at one of those if you want to. Let's say you were creating an entity about magazines and it had an attribute called magazine genre. Then you could have sports, or you could have fashion, beauty, kids. And they could have different types of genres. You could make up your own if it wasn't specific there, or you could leave it blank. Okay. Then we can see an example of length. So restricted choice is laid out with the semicolon and then a list after it with commas in between of everything that you need. So you can see we've got another restricted choice down here for room only, bed and breakfast, half board, full board. They've not put all inclusive, but those are obviously the options that were discussed with the customer. We've then got our length checks here. So we've got two that are length checks, just the word length, equals, and then the size. So the hotel reference, these ones up here, have to have a fixed size of 4. So 2 letters and 2 numbers. Now, it doesn't matter if somebody typed in 4 numbers there, that would still be accepted. We don't have to go to that level of validation. But we do need to make sure that it's a set length of 4. The phone number, as I mentioned earlier on, set length of 11. Also the size set to 11, which means that that is really maxing out the space that's being used inside that attribute and making it really good. Okay, then we've got this bit here. This is an example of how we do a foreign key. Okay, so the layout is always the same and you just replace the 2 words. So it says look up existing resort ID. So that resort ID is a foreign key here, but it's a primary key up here. So look up existing resort ID. So that word is just the same as whatever the word is in the attribute name here. From resort table. Now it says the word table because this is obviously a National 5 appendix. You could replace that with the word entity probably. That would be more appropriate for hire. And resort is just the name from up here. Okay, so if this was called something else, let's just say, I don't know, magazine genre or magazine name, then this would say look up existing magazine name from whatever this would be called, magazine table. Okay, so you just replace these 2 words, and again I would encourage you to use entity at the end there. Okay, the next example we've got is a range check. Okay, so range check's really similar to how we would do a conditional statement inside Visual Basic or something like that, but the only thing is you don't need to kind of put your variable names in effectively. Okay, so you're saying the range is, you've got your wee semicolon again, it has to be greater than or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 5. And you can see there's another example over here. It has to be greater than or equal to 2 o'clock, so 24-hour clock, and less than or equal to 4 o'clock. Okay, for check-in time. So all of them have that set kind of criteria, and their check-in times fall before that. You can use range checks on any fields which are numbers or dates or time. Okay, so you can do that with a date as well. If it has to be in the month of, let's say, January, you could say it has to be greater than or equal to the 1st of the 1st. And then the specific year maybe you're in. It doesn't work quite so well with dates unless you're going to be changing it every year, or less than or equal to a specific date. Or if it has to be within a year, then you could do that as well. Okay, so those are examples of all the different types of validation. Now for this week's task, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set you a blank copy for the game rentals data dictionary, and I'm going to give you 4 CSV files which you just open with Microsoft Excel, like a spreadsheet, and they have sample data for you inside them. Okay, and I want you to build up a data dictionary for all 4 of the entities for the game rentals table. Now it's important that you get the names right and you get the field names right, because they won't be in the CSV files from your entity relationship diagrams last week, and you have the marking schemes now because that's been marked by your teacher. Okay, so make sure you go back and have a look at the marking schemes and get those names of your fields right. It'll help you when you come to try and create the database. Okay, and then try as much as possible to complete the data dictionary, and we will give you the corrected copy after you've submitted it, and you can check if there's anywhere that you could have tweaked it or anywhere that you've went wrong. Okay, any questions, hit us up on Satchel 1 and we will speak to you later. Okay, bye.